Hi there, this is Bob Eubanks, and you're listening to Fab for Free For All. But doesn't everybody?
Welcome to another edition of the Fab for Free For All. My name is Rob Leonard, and joining me are my co-hosts Tony Truguardo.
Hi, folks.
And Mitch Axelrod.
Howdy, folks.
And today we're interviewing author of the latest book on John Lennon called John Lennon 1980, The Last Days in the Life. We're talking to Professor Kenneth Womack, who works at Monmouth University. We've also had him on to talk about the George Martin books he wrote and Solid State, Abbey Road, the history of Abbey Road, the album. And welcome back to our show, Ken. How are you?
So very good to see you guys.
Likewise, sir.
Thank you.
You wouldn't say that if you weren't wearing your glasses. Well, you are wearing your glasses, so maybe you should take it off.
Now he's taking them off.
Now it's even
really
better.
Good to see Tony.
We should say that this is also, besides a podcast, it is also a video podcast. So you might see the four of us in squares if you're watching it, and if not, you're listening and you don't care. So anyway, Ken, let's start off with the question I always start off with. Why did you write this book about the last days of John Lennon? What were you hoping to find?
Well, as you guys know as well as anybody, there are a lot of Beatles books, of course, but there are very, very many books on John Lennon, and in fact, a number of them that deal with this very period, perhaps not at the same, level of rigor and attention to time detail. But I felt like we needed a book that took a deep dive into what New York was like in the late 1970s and 1980 to understand the setting where John has this amazing comeback. We needed a book that wasn't a true crime study. I really felt like we needed a book that concentrated on him living and really didn't concentrate on the inevitable conclusion that we all know is coming.
Hey, Ken, we talked about this offline a little bit. I'm going to bring it up again. But how do you go about when you were thinking about this book? Obviously, a lot of people don't like to remember December 8th and the time leading up to it. So did that come into play when you were thinking about your research, how far to go with this? And maybe right off the bat, there would be a misconception or a misperception of what is in the book? Because there's been other books called, one's called December 8th, 1980. I didn't touch it because of that fact. I just don't want to remember because we lived it. So was there any consideration taken into those points?
I made a rule for myself at the beginning, which really served me well. And that was, if John can see it and it's right in front of him or experience it, or he would have logically heard about it. So, for example, maybe he wasn't in the room for one of Yoko's meetings with David Geffen, but she was calling him right away afterwards, right? That sort of thing. If it wasn't within his purview, or he might not have known it, it didn't go in. So that really insulated me from having to talk about the killer, for example. John never knows this guy. He has a brief interaction. It means that some of the salacious material covered in, say, Goldman book, for example, I don't have to go there. That's not part of what he's looking at and what he's seeing. So it really helped to have that rule because, of course, there are a lot of very controversial books that have been written about him. And I wanted mine to be about the music and the making of those great songs, which is what I think we're all interested in. And of course, it was John's own words, right? When he said many times in those last months of his life, you all want us to have a reunion, but it's the music that matters. You've got all those records.
Mm. Mm. You said a key, well, it's an obvious keyword for the topic, but you say the word music in there. You can't say music without muse. And the cool thing about the book is that the book is called 1980, but you start before that. And did you sort of have to find yourself kind of seeing how far you were going to backtrack? Because it seems to me like you start at a great point because you kind of start when John's muse is coming back in a way. And did that sort of become a focus for you, or just an important aspect of the book for you? Because you reflect it really well in the book, is the thought.
Right. And his his loss of muse or inspiration is very complicated, right? Because it's not some simple thing where he's just not inspired. As we know so well, John Lennon always had a live mind. Even when he might have been depressed, his mind was working. He was reading a lot. So I don't know that it was ever a case of not being inspired, but it's a complicated muse in the sense that he's also having to go back into a world that, as the 1970s wear on, he has increasingly not been a part of, right? So it becomes a crisis of confidence too, I would argue. And he's watching all of these acts that we now call dinosaurs, and some of whom I think may have been dinosaurs even then, walking the earth like Brontosauri. Rob, help me. Brontosaurus.
Brontosaurus
Yes.
There you go. That was helpful.
Thank you. I'm an English professor, everybody. In any event, he is seeing a very fraught and competitive world. And of course, he also has the small matter of an infant at home. And anyone who's ever been a parent understands how life-changing that is, particularly at this point in his life when he is slightly older and, of course, very dedicated to bringing up his son in a very contrasting way to how things went with Julie. So it's a complicated missing muse to talk about.
Right. But it's also
Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I was going to say, but it's also, as you mentioned, it's him getting back into that world again, and that's something that you also cover very, very well, in my opinion, just in terms of how he. It's almost as though the everything was stacking in his favor in a way to come back. And I like the way you put the pieces together in that. But did you kind of find that there were forces working towards him making this return in a way?
I suppose. You asked a moment ago, and I don't think I adequately answered your question. Why go back so far? Well, I didn't originally intend to do that, but we always have to think about those folks who may be coming to John Lennon for the first time, who may not understand why and how it was that the Lost Weekend occurred, who might not understand how the Beatles' interrelationships, even in their disbandment, were important, who might not understand how John's 5 years progressed. And of course, one of the great myths of that last period is that he wrote everything in Bermuda, which of course is not true. He had a number of these songs in various states of composition rather. I guess in some production, given the state of the demos, he had many of those already working. But yeah, I think a number of things worked in his favor. One of which was the fact that his kid was about to be 5, and he felt a little more confident about, leaving the home a little bit more. He had tried a number of other genres, which I think is very interesting. He had tried his mind movies, his sort of tape recorded comic adventures. He had tried to write his audio diary at one point. He had tried to write a musical. He had tried to write the story of the Ballad of John and Yoko longhand. So he had made many attempts, and of course, all along he's making his cartoons that were so beloved. So I do think things were aligning in the right way. And I don't know if I'm sure you guys remember this like I do. When he and Yoko took out their famous love letter, what was it, in 1979? Even as a very young person, I remember thinking, "Oh, that's a prelude to something coming."
Yeah.
I'm gonna have a John Lennon debut here. It's gonna be exciting.
At a time when we were like conscious and ready for it, which is very cool. Anyway.
Right. And I felt like they were, and I think it's correct, right, that they were testing the waters.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Ken, when you look back at the history of it, 4.5 years isn't a long time for an artist to walk away from the game, so to speak. But it was back then. Can you just give a little background for some people who might not realize that not putting out a record for 4 years about artists of John Lennon's stature was a big deal?
This is one of my favorite aspects of working on this project, and that is sort of, doing a little time travel and going back to the late 70s when life was appreciably different. Again, that's why I wanted to spend so much time making sure that setting for New York City felt real, because it's not the same place. You guys know that as well as anybody, better than I do, having been lifelong residents. So I wanted to make sure we could make that time jump, which is so important. It was a different world. John Lennon watched the same TV shows we did. He listened to the same music, and he often listened to it and watched it at the same time as we were watching it, because it was a smaller world in terms of technology, media, entertainment. And I just find that endlessly fascinating. But going back to your question, when you think about that period, there was a certain level of connection that we all shared, that's gone. And I like thinking about that. I like thinking about the way the music industry was, to be more specific. As you said, a band now, like U2 will take 3 or 4 years off. And that may be before they start thinking about the record. It's incredible how today's dinosaurs operate. I'm not going to try to pluralize anything anymore, but you're dead on right, Rob. I mean, it was just a different industry, but it was also different in the sense that, labels expected more out of their artists and more regular fare, every year practically, right?
Well, look at the Beatles. I mean, how many did they do a year?
Right.
Oh, God, yeah.
But, in the 70s, remember, labels would still invest in bands that didn't have a hit yet. So they might invest in 3 or 4 records. I mean, look at bands like REO Speedwagon or Supertramp, right? Their labels invested in them for a long time before they ever paid off. I'll never forget Rick Davies being on TV when Breakfast in America hit, and he's like, "We're finally going to get out of some of our debt. Not all of our debt, but we're going to be able to pay off some of it." And Breakfast in America, ruled the world for a moment there. So, but I think it's a very salient point. 4.5 years, not having a single out or any kind of peep as far as music goes was a big deal. And everybody noticed. Rolling Stone writers like Dave Marsh, for example, would call him out for it and would say, what gives here, pal?
Yeah. Ken, the writing style of the book, which I've told you I really loved, it feels like you're right there with John and whomever he's with. So two-part question for you. Thank goodness it's not a 4-part question. But the 2-part question is, how did you come up with that style? Because you weren't there with them, with John and whomever. And also, one person that you bring up a lot in the book is Fred Seaman, and he's kind of controversial to the whole John Lennon story, whether people know that or not. But so again, the writing style and Fred Seaman.
Sure. Well, I think the writing style is me for the most part. I want to feel like I'm in the room. I'm interested in nonfiction that gives you that sense, almost like an historical novel. Mm-hmm. That you're there, that you're watching something unfold, whether it's mundane or small or really earth-shattering. I like the feel of those kinds of books, and I think most people do. I think that's the trend that nonfiction is enjoying at the moment, and I believe will increasingly do.
Definitely.
So I just am interested in those kinds of books because, of course, what it does is it gives you a sense of non-certitude, right? You hear about things that are happening, but they haven't happened yet. And I learned a lot about that writing about George Martin, because until 1966, they were still worried that, someday this might all collapse on us. There's a place where we may have to get jobs, so there's a lot of risk still in the air, even at that late date. Of course, back in 1966, who imagines retiring as a rock and roller? You don't. So that's also a very different period, but I like that kind of unfolding of a story. We're also fortunate a number of folks have just done some great work in providing excellent reference materials for this kind of study, and others really about John Lennon. You've got Chip Mattinger with his book, Lennonology, which, think about it. 10, 15 years ago, we weren't even sure about when some things happened, right. To be quite frank, right. So that's a wonderful luxury to be able to pinpoint dates. Ken Sharp's book, Starting Over, he talked to many people who are no longer with us. So, that's very valuable in the same way that Mark Lewison for Tune In managed to speak to several people in the nick of time before they shuffled off this mortal coil. There's the English professor, Rob. You can feel better now. So part two of the question, though, is Fred Seaman. And I got some knocks about Fred even before the book was published by folks who had heard about the story. And they said, you better not talk to Fred. Several people very upset about this. And all I can say to them is, well, two things. One, you have to talk to Fred. And I understand why he's a controversial figure. He made a number of very serious mistakes in his 20s and compounded them later with other actions. I think he's aware of that. I think despite what we may read, I think he adored John and Yoko, almost to the point, I mean, it's almost worshipful at times, in a good way. And of course, you can ask him, and what was the most exciting time when you worked with John and Yoko? Making Double Fantasy. He was watching it happen, you know, but he is a controversial figure. But there are so many instances in that last year where he is the only guy there.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you would literally have weeks go by with very little to report. And, you know, Fred was his guy. Fred was his assistant who, fortunately, Fred saved many of the lists of things that he would go procure for John, you know, even if it was his dry cleaning or books or records. It's fascinating reading, food, a lot of food. You know, those are just indelible and vital documents that we have because of this guy. And again, you know, you put that together with some of the sources I just named, and you start to get a clear picture that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Right.
Having said that, you know, I worked really hard to go out and be able to, with all of this material, confirm it. You know, I mean, Fred has moments in his book where he editorializes. You know, that didn't have a place here
Right.
because I wanted to, you know, you guys all know I'm sure you do. The first rule of writing is show, not tell.
Yes.
Right. So if you're going to show, not tell, you're going to do less editorializing and more simply demonstrating what's happening in a particular scene. And I think that helps with that kind of challenge. But I understand why people have strong opinions about him. I understand in some cases it's a, I don't know, I guess it's a warm-hearted defense of Yoko, but she's pretty tough. I think she can handle it. But secondly, I don't know how you explore parts of this story without hearing from him.
Right.
At some level.
You know, Ken, you mentioned the in defense of Yoko, and you also talk about show and tell. And the one thing in the book that is definitely a takeaway for me is that you show the relationship between John and Yoko. And was there a sense of discovery for you about, not to be, you know, hokey, but in a way, it's sort of like you're writing this story about the comeback, the music, etc. But so much of it seems to be intertwined with like the subtitle of the Double Fantasy album. It's a heart play, you know. But did you find yourself sort of wanting to make sure you did justice to the John and Yoko story at that sort of end of its run, just as much so as the music side in a way?
You bet. And I think, as you're suggesting, Tony, it was integrally involved, right? Because what's beautiful about them and what I love about their story, and I have a greater appreciation for it now than I certainly did before, is how they served as each other's cheerleaders in the best possible way. You know, here they are, they're married at this point for 12 years. And we've had, you know, in the intervening years, many books that have speculated wildly, sometimes quite meanly, quite frankly, about them. And all I can see, at least for the part that matters to them, is that they are incredible cheerleaders for each other. And 12 years into a marriage, that's a pretty damn good thing.
Yeah.
You know, they, and even the way, and you can see John speaking in similar tones about, you know, the other Beatles. And in quite moving ways. Even when he wanted to bash George at one point in his interview with David Sheff, he says, now don't go too far with this because I love that guy.
Right.
I'm mad at him right now, but this will pass. And speaking about Paul on his very last hours, about how he would do anything for him. So I found that all to be very moving, but especially so with Yoko, who has been this lightning rod forever, and so often unfairly. And I have a greater appreciation for why. Whatever happened in that marriage, and that's their business, right? That's not the story of this book. Whatever it was, they really fought hard for each other. And those scenes when they're with David Geffen are moving, Yoko pulling David Geffen aside and saying, this is important to John, and John doing the very same thing. This Yoko hasn't had a hit like we have had, and these sorts of conversations. I find that really moving. And the most moving moment for me in the book, the entire thing, is 10 days before he's murdered. And they've learned that, the album is not selling like they thought it would. And Yoko comes to him in the living room and the Dakota, and she has to tell him this thing. And she knows it's important to him because, he has this plan to go back triumphantly to England. He's going to take an ocean liner, up the Thames to London, and then make his way like a conquering hero with Sean and Yoko. And they're going to go up to Liverpool to the family home, and see the relatives and all of this great business. And he is sort of set up in his mind the way that this will take place. And she says, it's just not selling like we thought it would, and she's basically there to apologize or break the bad news. And he says, it's okay. We've still got the family. And I love that because that is not the guy that John Lennon was in earlier years. By his own admission, he would have these primal fits, right, when things went wrong, or he would become depressed. And instead, I like to think that when he says that, he's recognizing that it was the experience of making that music that mattered.
Yeah.
And not how it's going to be received. He got what he was going to get out of it in truth. And of course, 10 days later, there he is in the last hour, perhaps, of his life saying, this is the direction. Yeah. When they work on Walking on Thin Ice, so he's always looking forward in the right way.
Yeah.
At that point in his life.
Ken, one thing I really enjoyed about the book is we know that John goes down to Bermuda, and that's where he focuses, that he knows that he's coming back and he's going to make a record, basically. And he starts to rewrite other songs that, were different, but maybe he borrowed parts and bits and pieces. And I noticed in the book, your chapters the same way. There's a definite focus, I think, on, okay, this is where it starts. Everything before leads to this, but this is where it starts. And I was wondering, was that on purpose? And how important was John going to Bermuda? Why not, Canada? Why not England? Why not anywhere? Why did he go to Bermuda? And the focus on those demos, which some of them would be rewritten, and then of course something like Woman, came right out of there. So,
yeah, I think the answer to that is, he had to make his seafaring voyage. He had been putting all of this effort for months now into learning how to sail with Tyler Conis. And, he was going to make this trip. And the easiest trip was to go from Newport, Rhode Island to Bermuda. And I believe it was also because, I apologize if I'm making a mistake here, but I think it was also because Yoko had a directional guy who had talked about going in a southeasterly direction. Mm-hmm. And so, they look at the geography, and it makes sense to take a charter from Rhode Island to Bermuda, which was a fairly common charter. And I think that's the most important reason why he gets there. But he's also, unabashedly a fan of reggae. So he's excited about the idea of soaking up some of the music. He'd like to be in a different place too. There are these moments throughout the Beatles' career where they will have sojourns in other places, to work on some material. And he did need to finish a lot of songs. There were literally dozens of them. He would carry them around in his bag, and he'd have all these cassettes with him and that sort of thing. But I think it has a lot to do with that charter.
It's interesting you bring that up because you're talking about, going to different places, but it's funny how there isn't too much a sign of him having really done much writing in Japan when he'd gone with Yoko and with the family, which is interesting. I'm thinking back to, wow, yeah, sure, they went to Rishikesh, they went to and all the inspiration that gave, and Bermuda was a huge inspiration, but there wasn't that trip to Japan is sort of, which you talk about in the book, but
multiple trips to Japan.
Yeah, but not really too much in the way of production from that side, which is interesting. He didn't come back and he wrote a reggae record, didn't come back and write a Japanese sounding piece of music.
That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know I hadn't spent enough time thinking about that. I mean, we know his according to Elliot Mintz, his last performance, right, was in their suite in 1977 with acoustic guitar, where a couple randomly gets off the elevator and turns around and leaves. I wish we had that set list.
I wish we had their names.
That's true.
Well, there was probably a version of Sakura probably in there. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Could be. Yeah, that's interesting. That bears some more research.
Yeah.
Ken, another big player, another character, so to speak, in John and Yoko's life and New York life was the Dakota. And obviously it's big in this book. You go into very good detail and depth about the Dakota, which I hadn't read before, which is kind of nice because, you always wonder, why did John and Yoko pick the Dakota? Can you talk about the Dakota in terms of John and Yoko?
Sure. And, and they adored their home. And to her, her credit, there she is today. Yoko still living there. I think many of us might have left, right? But yeah. I don't know. I think there's also something prideful to say about staking your claim, and staying there, sort of like Jackie, right? Jackie O or Jackie Kennedy, with the dress on that terrible day. It is a character in the story, almost as much as many of the people, because it is this place they selected very carefully. It was pre-tested with a seance, as you know. They checked out the karma of the place. It provided them, and this does matter in the 70s, right? Upper West Side, it had some seedy places, but it felt safer than their place down in the Village, right? Yeah. So they chose this place very, very specifically. It gave them an entree into being able to get more apartments, which I think is equally interesting. Today rock stars like a Bruce Springsteen or a Paul McCartney have, I think in both of their cases, multiple warehouses where they store the paraphernalia that you gather over a long career. At this point, John has a lot of stuff that they've been accumulating, and it's sort of off in various pockets. I remember talking to May Pang about how she brought some of it back to New York from Tittenhurst Park, as part of her assignment. So that second apartment that they later procure, apartment 71, is the place where they store a lot of this stuff. And they have a basement storage unit and a couple of other places in the building. So it really is their home. I mean, they have all of this material in it. And I find it interesting in that way. It's also interesting in that it's so often described, and I do it too, as a fortress-like building, right? It seems impenetrable. And yet, again, we're going back to the 70s, right? People keep getting in. Kids get in.
Great story in there.
Paul Gorish gets in, pretending to be a TV repairman. The people are getting through sometimes on the phone. It's kind of nutty on how many folks are able to get through that system. But of course, it felt different because it was the 1970s. You expected kids to make prank calls and do silly things and sneak into places because you figured they were harmless, because in our experience, they really mostly were.
Yeah, but John and Yoko didn't, hold themselves up there like a lot of people think. Also, you said fortress. They joined in a bunch of things that were happening at Dakota, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They participated annually in the potluck. They looked forward to it. They had commerce with their neighbors. They knew who they were. They were friendly with some, not as friendly with others, like, say, Lauren Bacall, who kind of got tired of the fans, who essentially never left in her lifetime, if you think about it.
Maybe she got jealous.
Could be.
And we should specify that potluck had nothing to do with, for those who don't know the term, that was when everyone brought their own meals, as opposed to
Not their own pot.
who had the best dough.
That's right.
Anyway.
Until Paul McCartney visited.
Yeah, right.
That's right. That would be different.
Then it was real potluck.
Yeah. No, and John and Yoko would bring sushi. They were always proud to,
Right.
which meant something different back then because people weren't as used to it as part of their cuisine.
Yeah.
Yeah, Leonard Bernstein and his family lived there, and at one potluck, he had them learn a round of one of John's poems that they sang for him, and he loved it. And Bernstein was a huge Lennon and Beatles fan.
Right.
So, while there was some friction because of the sheer amount of attention he drew, for the most part, his neighbors loved him. And liked. There was a certain cachet, I'm sure, with being in a building where they lived.
It's nice to hear that, because I always thought that John and Yoko didn't have a lot of friends. We heard about Peter Boyle and his wife Lorraine, but I always felt that they were kind of alone a lot of the times, that there wasn't a lot of people around them, because it just, they didn't travel with a real entourage or anything. And I always got that impression they didn't know as many people as we would expect them to know. You expect Mick to show up every night. He doesn't.
No.
Stuff like that.
Even though he lives nearby, yeah.
Or Paul does show up a bunch of times, but
he's not welcome.
He said he's told to come back another day, which is understandable.
Sure.
So
if you notice though, a lot of the friends you start to see them have during this period are like any couple, in their late 30s, or in Yoko's case, early 40s. A lot of the friends are the parents of the other kids your kid plays with. So when you look at the, at the birthday parties that John and Sean have, their twin birthday parties, I think several years at Tavern on the Green, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of those kids and the parents are coming because of, of the friends of Sean, like the folks who live just next door, who in fact own Tavern on the Green. So they have this kind of shared group of kids who hang out, and that's how parents often develop their friends, right? At that point. And the rest of the time, and I think John and Yoko fall into this category, you're exhausted.
Yeah. Imagine
and then you wake up and you try and do it the next day.
A play date, and your parents, the parents are John and Yoko,
Hey,
Kids got you up all night, and you got to sell a cow and record an album on this.
Anyway,
Right.
We're going to take a break right now. You're listening to the Fab Four Free for All, our interview with Kenneth Womack, author of John Lennon, 1980, The Last Days in His Life. We'll be back right after this.
Hi, folks. This is Tony from Fab 4 Free for All. As Mitch has mentioned several times, the cast of Fab 4 Free for All do not profit in any way doing these shows for all of you. In fact, we actually lose money because of studio time and other production expenses. Now, we have looked into show sponsors, but for a number of reasons, we've decided it would be in the best interest of all of us, including you, our listeners, not to have sponsored ads in our shows. So, what we've done is set up a Patreon account. Patreon is a crowdfunding platform that allows artists to obtain funding from patrons on a recurring basis. Now, it can be as little or as much as you think you can send to us for the work that we put into providing quality Fab 4 Free-for-All shows. Now, we know that we have thousands of worldwide listeners, and if each of you just contributed $1 a month, that's just 25 cents per episode, we would have enough to retire and not have to do these shows. Sorry. Seriously, though, we've gotten some great feedback from everyone about how much these shows mean to you, and we feel the same way. But it would be nice if we could break even in terms of costs so that we can continue to bring these shows to you in a timely fashion. Yeah, I know, we can be delayed every once in a while, but that's because, as John Lennon so beautifully said, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. But we do vow to make every effort to have a quality show to you every week. We only ask that everyone go and visit patreon.com to at least check out what it's all about and to see if you can contribute a little something in return for all the hard work and effort that we put into these shows for you. Just do a search for Fab 4 Free for All and tell us that you give a buck about what we do. Thanks to all of you for being such great loyal listeners.
We're back here on the Fab 4 Free for All We are talking with Ken Womack. He is the author of John Lennon, 1980, The Last Days in the Life, published by Omnibus Press, available wherever you get your books. Mitch, you said you want to ask a question about
I wanted to just touch a little bit more about the Dakota, because it was very surprising. I love that there's revelations in this book. I mean, I think I know everything on the Beatles, which I don't.
Well, you say you want a revelation. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I should hang up right now.
Yeah.
Anyway, but like, there was a bunch right in the first, chapter or so. But one that I really didn't know about, and probably because I didn't read too much up on it, was that John Lennon was visited by George Martin in the Dakota. And I don't know how many people really know, they all know about Paul coming in and, going to Saturday Night Live and Ringo there a lot. But I don't think many people knew that George Martin had visited him.
Well, they certainly, George Martin and John Lennon had a pretty rough 1970s for a couple of reasons. Mostly on the John Lennon side. John was pretty cantankerous in the early 70s. He was a regular correspondent and letter to the editor writer, and of course, very frequently interviewed. And he had caught wind of, George Martin's remarks about the heady days of working with the Beatles, and had felt that he was taking too much credit at times. This wasn't the first time they felt this way. At the end of the summer of 1967, Time famously had a huge spread on the Beatles and gave a lot of credit to the genius behind the Beatles, George Martin. They noticed that, this wasn't a new thing. But by this point, George wasn't necessarily floundering, but he was trying out a lot of new acts, including some that John Lennon probably had never heard of before. And he kind of mocked that. And George took it pretty badly. He took it very personally. Fortunately, in 73, George Martin's credentials get burnished in a big way with Live and Let Die. He starts working with America and sort of gives their career a much needed jump start. So he starts to see a lot of great positives in his career as producer. But it does create this kind of schism between them. At one point, John Lennon wrote a letter to the editor where he said, "Don't forget, we still love you, George." I think he realized, as he often did, that he'd gone too far. Anyway,
but he also did say that he wanted to re-record all the stuff.
Well, that was in 1979.
Yeah.
So in December 1979, according to George Martin, George went there. Now, I asked Fred about this when I was working on the George Martin book, because I knew he was John and Yoko's guy. And he said, "You know what? I don't have any recollection of it, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen." He said, because as George Martin says, everybody was out. So we were out somewhere else doing something else. And he said, if that's George's memory, then it belongs to him. And so I followed up, I believe, wow, I'm suddenly blanking on his name. I apologize. Philip Norman, the author of Shout, had a citation to this effect. So I thought, okay. And it is an interesting meeting because it happens at an interesting time. And you had been asking about this earlier, I think, Tony, right? About how things were falling into place. Mm-hmm. And that one audio diary that John records in the fall around the time of his 39th birthday is so important because you can hear his stress about, the legacy acts like Dylan and McCartney and others. And he's bristling at them, and he's working through something. And as you read about and study 1979 and those last months, he really seems to be finally putting a couple of those demons maybe in the right place. And the George Martin meeting was good for him in the sense that John's a familiar face. As Yoko said, he was always happy when he saw people from the British Isles come by to visit, and especially somebody like George Martin, who had figured so strongly in their story. George and John really only saw each other once, maybe twice in all of the 1970s. So, there was an estrangement there. Maybe he was there to commiserate over the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack from 19. I'm kidding. I'll stop there.
Oh, that was that Bee Gees effigy burning they did outside the Dakota, right? That was it.
Right. It was Robin Gibb who said that, once you hear their version of Golden Slumbers, it will become the standard.
Oh,
Yeah, it fell somewhat short of that.
Just a
I'm
little
announcing
bit.
this for the first time on the Fab Four Free for All. Anyway, there's your scoop. Anyway, but yeah, that's the night that John famously said, if he could, he'd go back and record everything they did. And of course, this is the entirety of George Martin's legacy he's talking about, rightly so. I mean, I don't think we can underscore enough his role in that band's success. And John even underscored that especially he would re-record Strawberry Fields Forever, which George Martin had served up to John's specifications, working with, Jeff Emmerich, et cetera. So anyway, he took that kind of badly until he thought to himself, and I like this, and I think it's a good way for us to think about the complexities and contradictions of John Lennon. He said, it makes sense because in John's mind, what he's trying to do and the reality of what we can do with music will never live up to his imagination.
yeah.
His imagination is grander than anything that you can record with a microphone or, a typewriter. It is more vivid. And he's always working toward that. And of course, Paul McCartney had the same affliction, right? Trying to capture the sound in your head is at a certain level an impossible quest. So George really consoled himself with that. And of course, a year later, the worst possible thing happens. And then all he can think about is Sean and Yoko and Julian. Yeah.
It's interesting though, too, because I remember here we had the famous Dennis Elsis interview on WNEW FM where John showed up and he plays a track from the John McLaughlin album as part of his DJing. And Dennis Elsis says, produced by, and John finishes, produced by our old pal George Martin, and does like a shout out, which is kind of not necessarily an apology, but it's just nice to see that, like you said, it's John. It's just John going, back
and he loved all those guys. He loved all those guys, and he knew what was going on.
Yeah.
He always knew. He always seemed to know what was going on. He knew about silly love songs. He knew and liked it apparently, despite what folks like to believe. But he also admired a pop hit, right? And that was a pop hit. So I find that to be a moving story about these guys getting together and and sharing that kind of moment.
You bring in another character who's obviously always around, but in the end of John's life in this productive year, and we touched on it a little bit earlier, but McCartney and it particularly and coming up, and that seemed to be a very important. It seems to be a very important element in this story, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and again, go back to Fred for a moment. We know about the finer details of which happened not far from where some of you are right now.
10 minutes away.
Yeah, that 10 minutes, 5 minutes as the Mitch flies. Do
I fly?
You
only when I'm with McCartney.
Yeah, that's right. Anyway, we know some of the finer details because Fred was driving the car when the song came on the radio, and John gives in several interviews credit to Paul for reigniting, his muse with Coming Up. It brought back the old competitive energy.
That's kind of cool, though, isn't it?
The studio version.
Story. Yeah, he liked the studio version. He actually at one point in another interview says, and I'm not talking about that live version. I'm talking about the studio version. I want the weird one. I like the weird one.
So he was aware of everything going on.
He really was. And, and of course, the guys in the studio in August and September were peppering him with questions because they knew material really well, thanks to Jack Douglas's arranger. They were always asking him questions about the Beatle days. Why'd you guys break up? And John said 3 words, Maxwell Silver Hammer, and then when they're double tracking, John said, we got a double track. I learned that from the guy, George Martin, pushed the button, said double track, So he was steeped in his own history. There's no doubt about it, in the right way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Ken, by the way, George Martin was paid a lot of money to do the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack. A lot of money. I think it opened up his studio in Montserrat.
Oh, no. I've heard numbers in the double-digit millions for that project. No. He made more money off of that than anything.
Right. Probably the original Pepper.
They gave us Odessa. They're forgiven. So anyway, I'm just kidding.
Anyway, Ken, let's get into the recording of Double Fantasy. Here they, as always with John, he records those 22 songs with him and Yoko, or him and Yoko songs, very, very quickly. I mean, I know the band had an idea what the music was, but still, they were done in 2 weeks. The main part of the songs, they had to add on some things, but basically 2 weeks they were done. That's incredible.
Well, and as you know, I mean, that's John's MO, right? He likes to get in and work on something, and he knows what he wants to get, and he'll be surprised along the way. He's okay with that too, but he doesn't like to spend an inordinate amount of time in the studio, which must have explained, how he felt irritated at times during Sgt. Pepper and the White Album, right? Which just went on forever. But nevertheless, yeah, that was his MO. And as I've said frequently, the all-star of the production is Jack Douglas's great decision to bring in Tony DeVillio to do all of those arrangements, because then it had this band, it placed them in the enviable space of being able to then ad lib and create lots of other moments in the studio that wouldn't have been possible because they would have been learning the songs in a more textured fashion. So I think Tony DeVillio just does marvelous work.
Yeah, and that was unique for John too, that approach. I mean, John had never done anything like that in his solo career. Like I said, the expediency is one thing, but having an arranger like that, was a tremendous advantage. And I could see that definitely as being the future of how they were going to.
He would never have given that up, right? I mean, that enabled him to do exactly what Rob was just saying in a flash, to be able to come in and the band knows your songs. You don't have to say, hey, you drummer, do this, He did like to do that. And as you know, you can hear that on a lot of the outtakes. Not that drummer,
Or they'll say, play it like Ringo.
Play it like Ringo, yeah. So they brought Paul in. No, I'm kidding.
He would have come.
Probably, yeah.
He would.
Well.
But Tony, just what you were saying, he sort of did that with Walls and Bridges. He went in with the band and rehearsed the band. There's all those great outtakes, which are almost, or maybe sometimes better than the release version, because there was a certain relaxation about the rehearsals.
That's true.
I do hope one day we do see a Walls and Bridges box set just based on that. Because some of those rehearsals were fantastic.
Yeah.
And there is a similar vibe, actually, he liked that kind of camaraderie. He just didn't want it to go on for years.
Right.
But I know this is speculating, Ken, but, he seemed to develop a rapport with those guys. And again, talking about moving on to another recording project after, he liked those guys enough that once the album situation was wrapped up, the one thing that, and one thing I love about the book is very joyful, but the fact that the book is joyful, the ending makes you almost sadder because of what would have possibly come. And where I'm going is a possible tour with those guys. And, to me, that's one of the most interesting things about the end game, the end of the story.
Yeah, he loved working with them. They were a crack band.
They were really good.
Yeah,
they really were. And they were selected very, very shrewdly by Jack. And of course, John had some input too, but it was a smart setup there. And they had, they were talking, from my understanding from Ken Sharp, they were talking about pretty early on touring. In fact, at the wrap party, after they do the first round of the principal takes, they were having a nice meal and they're bringing it up. And of course, John's thinking, well, it'll be like those Beatle tours, right? You just got to figure out enough songs for 30 minutes. And I think it was Tony Levin who had just performed with Paul Simon. He's like, no, you do 2 hours now.
2 hours.
But you do 2 hours, but you could hear yourself during those 2 hours.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because the ampage now, the wattage, it's a whole different story. He really got into it, though. He was making sketches of ideas for stage design. He was inspired, like I think all of us were, by that wonderful, kooky Ashes to Ashes video. So he had video ideas that he was kicking around and increasingly elaborate ideas about what you could do with stagecraft.
Wow.
And it would have been a blast, right? And again, I go back to my anecdote earlier. Yes, the album was moving slowly, but two things would have made that thing own the charts for a good bit of time. And one of those was that Annie Leibovitz photo. If we had been able to see that cover photograph, not in a state of just traumatized, abject mourning when that issue of Rolling Stone came out, it would have created an interesting sensation, right, around the country and the world. And then to follow that up with maybe a spring tour, you know, they're number one on their own merits. And of course, that's what increasingly bands were doing at that point. It's like today, not COVID today, but today, you know, if you want to make money, you go on the road and you get out there and promote your album. That's why Paul McCartney was in Glasgow, right? In December 1979. It was to push Back to the Egg, which had felt sluggish. And certainly Columbia felt that way.
You know, Ken, we mentioned the whole relationship with Yoko. And obviously he would have toured with her because he did say, you know, it would be a tour with John and Yoko. I think he said, I hope they would have accept us. You know, I forgot what he said, but it was to be both of them. And you said, you know, he was her cheerleader very much. I wanted to talk a little bit about, you know, Walking on Thin Ice, because we all know it's, you know, the last thing he was working on. But it was also, it showed John Lennon's chops, that he didn't really lose his chops as a guitarist. Some of his best work, I think, and most innovative work, but for her, not as John Lennon, but for Yoko Ono.
I unabashedly adore that song and that production and the way Jack and the two of them got together, and they basically rebuilt that song. They kept some of the tracking that they looped, from my understanding, but they built that thing from the ground up. She came up with the wonderful spoken word poem, those great effects, Jack looping when she's singing ice, ice, ice. It's just wonderful. The guitar solo, which I guess Jack gets a big assist on, you know, that's it's just wonderful stuff. Can you imagine that live? It would have been fabulous. In fact, you know, you can see Yoko perform it pretty well live on YouTube. You know, I recommend folks check that out. But it was just a tour de force, and you can tell they were having a blast making it. In fact, they were making it last in a way. You know, did they really need to be there all those hours while they were working on it? You know, I think that it was just such a wonderful experience. And clearly John was in love with the song. You know, by everyone's account, he was playing it over and over again, you know.
But also,
I have too, so I get that.
But one thing about the sessions, John didn't play on every Yoko song, which I never understood, because he played differently as a guitarist, as Walking on Thin Ice proves, on her stuff than he did on his own stuff.
And as Approximately Infinite Universe points out too.
Or Plastic Ono Band, Yoko's version.
Yep.
Well, no, there would have been some great live tunes there too. Kiss, Kiss, Kiss would have been fun. Every Man Has a Woman Who Loves Him. I can see those being, you know, just great.
Would they have done that as there's talk about speculation. Would they have done that as a duet live? I mean, that would have maybe been that would have been fascinating.
You're right.
I can't imagine. I can't imagine John not being on stage and just eating all that up.
Right.
You know.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So, Ken, a quick question for you. Talk about the Cheap Trick version of "I'm Losing You."
Yeah, you know, I'm not. I differ a little bit from the critical main here. I love that version. I love that it's in the world. I love that we've had it. We've had it for a long time. But of course, in my brain, it felt like years till we really had a great version of it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But so I'm still traumatized by that interregnum. But anyway, I love it. And what the other song was, I'm Moving On. Mm-hmm. And they also tore that one up pretty good. A lot of credit to them. I can see why they didn't select those versions, though. You know, I mean, they're sort of
misfits.
Yeah, they are misfits because they're a little more crunchier on the heavy metal side.
Yeah. Yeah, but if you think about it, think about Yoko songs. They were, you know, some of those songs were really out there, where John's songs were very right down the middle of the main street.
Yeah, and he loved talking about that. He remember his line about that? Yeah, they're middle of the road, right down the middle of the road to the bank.
Yeah, exactly.
Great line.
But they were also more polished. I mean, the whole album was very polished, even Yoko's stuff. So when you come to the Cheap Trick stuff, it's not as polished. It's a little more punkish, and I don't think it would have fit with the rest. I mean, those songs were the only ones that didn't use the double fantasy band, and most of them. So
Right.
I like Andy Newmark on drums, and
Right.
so it was it didn't. Although, like you said, they're really good, and it's nice to have them out there. But I'm with you, Ken. I really like the versions of those two songs that are on the album much better. Just my own
and
opinion.
imagine, if we're going to fantasize, and once you start talking about tours, you are, because we all know the awful truth. I mean, wouldn't it have been interesting to see them make an album with Cheap Trick?
Cheap Trick as the opening band on the tour.
Sure. Yeah, well,
Well, John was known to be cheap, so it could have been called Cheap Lennon.
There they go.
Sorry, I had to. Come on.
Oh, his.
Ooh, here's to Mitch.
Thank you. Talk a little bit about Paul Goresh. I mean, he took some amazing photos. Did you get to talk to Paul?
I did not. We texted or email messaged, or maybe it was Facebook a long time ago, but it was nothing of substance. And I think he's put everything on the record before he died that he was going to say. He's just an interesting story, right? Certainly in the way he gets involved is, we have words for that now that they didn't use then. Stalker, right? I mean, I mean, that's
True.
But he was a nice stalker. He didn't shoot anyone.
right. But it was the brutal truth of it is, that kind of behavior. It was the same thing, sneaking backstage for a concert, right? Today they would lay you out.
Oh, totally.
It's just again going back to our conversation before the break. It was a different time. And so Paul goes to pretty extraordinary lengths, and actually more problematic after the pretending to be a cable repairman part of the incident, more problematically, with the telephoto lens across the street and those sorts of things. That was behavior that definitely got under John's skin. And I think I do speculate a little bit. I mean, was he befriending, or was he allowing Goresh to befriend him simply because he wanted to keep him in the right place in his life? John was a smarter politician than people give him credit for. He probably also just, felt a kinship with him. All the folks I've talked to who knew him during that period, or even tangentially would see him in the park or what have you, talked about how he was excited to talk to just about anybody, that he was extremely human about things. In fact, folks would talk about how they would speak to him, and no sooner had they done that than he wanted to find out about their lives. Right. That's what he was interested in. How are you doing? Tell me about what's it like to live, near the Axelrods over there.
It's nothing.
Yeah.
Believe me.
But he was genuinely interested and loved people.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring up something important. You had access to a bunch of the photographers, because Paul Goresh ended up being a photographer for John Lennon, obviously watching the Wheels picture sleeve and stuff like that. But you had other pictures in there, like from Roger Farrington. What I wanted to ask was, because the one thing I love about this book is that you give context to so many things and to so many pictures. So now and we have to talk about that picture of John with his arms raised in the studio, greeting Earl Slick. I want to talk about that because now when you read the book, you could actually, and you see all the pictures that we've seen in the last 40 years, you can actually almost like a flip book. You can see the action now because of the context, given in your book. So I love that.
Well, I appreciate that you notice that, because that's the great value of aggregated scholarship, right? You're bringing disparate stories together to give us a better version, or hopefully a more complete picture, pun intended in this case, of what's happening. So yeah, Farrington, that was in the same 2-week period. I talked to Roger Farrington. We met up in Massachusetts near his home, and we went picture by picture of every photo he took on August 7th, 1980. And he gets to the one, And he said, oh, that's when Earl Slick walked in. And suddenly I have, it's my favorite photo from the entire sessions. And I said, okay, now I know what's going on. I always just loved it. And of course, it's a magnificent moment because Earl told me, or Slick as he's known, that in that moment, John was excited to see him. And he was a little befuddled because he had not met John Lennon before in his memory. And of course, John says, no, we worked on the Bowie sessions together. Come on. And Earl said, well, I think I'd remember if I'd spoken to a Beatle. And then later he had to sort of admit, that maybe he had not always been entirely there during those Bowie experiences they shared. So, but it became a running joke as things would be with John. You can hear him in the outtakes saying, do you remember me now? Do you remember me now? It was sort of, but Earl was actually fulfilling the role that Jack Douglas wanted him to fulfill. And that was to be this kind of wild card. Mm. While you had these other guys who were very slick studio musicians, and I didn't even mean that.
There you go.
These very long resumes, Earl Slick was relatively young.
Yeah.
I love the story about Hugh McCracken. Tell that one.
Where he tells him that, I know you've played on Paul's records. That was an audition, to see if you're
such a great line, though.
Well, and that's what he did, right? I mean, you go back and read reminiscences by folks who spent time with him at any point over the years, and he would, for all of his own demons, and he was very open with us about the challenges he had about abandonment and loneliness and all sorts of other issues. He did his damnedest to help people feel at ease. Yeah. Stuart Zolotaro, who took that beautiful photo on the back cover of my book. He came to me out of the blue. He found me before anybody knew that this book was coming out. And he said, I want you to look at this photo. You can use it if you want. I thought, wow. And I've gotten these kind of emails before. You guys probably have too, many times. And it's nothing, it's like a photocopy of a photocopy.
Oh, believe me.
Yeah. And this thing comes through and it's this glossy, beautiful thing. And I'm like, tell me the story. Let's go. And It's an amazing story. He's working on his portfolio. He's just gotten his BA, I believe down in Maryland. And he happens to know Helen Seaman. And Helen's like, John would probably let you take a shot of him and Yoko. You can put it in your portfolio. And of course, he's got to be thinking, that's not going to happen. That's too good. Well, he's up in the city. He does what she says. He calls up and the doorman's like, yeah, they'll be down in 10 minutes. And 10 minutes later, they show up and, John is having just a wonderful time ribbing this kid. He's like, you got to take more than one shot, because what if it doesn't take, and he's just having all this fun with him. And then, Stu takes these wonderful shots of them going up, I guess, Central Park West.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
The other shot that was really funny was, well, not funny, but that led to a great story, which we've seen before, the one of John with Paul Goresh. And it looks like John has something under his arm, and you tell the story about that. And there's a great line by John at the end of that story.
That's the one with that's on release day. And they're up front, and he gave a copy to Paul, and some guy walked up and said, hey, you're giving those away? And John's like, yeah, you just need to go over to the Sam Goody over.
Record sales. That's what it's called.
You always got to be selling.
Yeah, that's great.
His first prize is it's a set of steak knives. You don't want second prize.
Yeah, you didn't want Paul getting the steak knives. I mean, geez. Paul McCartney getting.
No, yeah, of course. Well, he was already dead by then. He died at 66. I don't know if.
I know. I said. There you go. Got it.
Yeah.
He did it.
I love those stories, though. I mean, they just they're lovely, and
they tell they really do add a lot of color, so to speak, to the pictures, the stories, themselves. When you see them now, you think of that story, so it's not just a picture.
And also too, though, Ken, you put it in perspective. Also, we keep talking about that they're parents, but he was also in a way reacting the way any parent of a 5-year-old who is now finally getting out of the house. They'll talk to anybody. It's that not just that he's John Lennon, it's this idea of, I've been in the house watching Sesame Street for the last however many years. So there was probably an element of that too, that just to be back out in the world again and, with musicians and with people who, speak the lingo, get the jokes, that had to be a welcome thing for him in such a big way. So
well, one thing I liked about your book, and it's the fact that we hear this, we've heard the stories. Yoko bought sold cows for $250,000, or they bought a place down in Miami Beach, which right now is up for sale, or they had a place out on Long Island. This was, if you think about it, they weren't the first ones to do this, but they got a lot of publicity for it. I mean, the Stones recording Exile on Main Street for tax reasons in France is just a similar variation of, Yoko buying or selling cows or buying real estate. And I think at the time, and I think in the book, it shows it. This is what rock stars had to do to save their money. They just couldn't put in the Roosevelt Savings Bank.
But in Ken's book, it comes off like the cool thing about it is it's got the perspective of this is this like domestic couple, and this is how they function together, which is kind of cool. Like you think about the Stones, and the Stones are, a bunch of messed up dudes who have good businessmen working for them. We know Jagger's really an accountant at heart, but with John and Yoko, there's just that funny aspect to it of the domestic couple. It's just like at the end of the song, just stay around for a little while. Don't just go and buy a cow.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because we talked about the cheerleading aspect. She did him a big solid by taking over the morass of the Beatles. This was a different phase. So the early phase in the early 1970s was, okay, Paul's suing us to end the partnership, right? And so they have to work through that, and the unbelievable litigation associated with that story. Well, then that gets taken care of, and then the next thing you know, we're going to watch the EMI contract come to a conclusion, and then we're all going to be at sea, right?
Yeah.
And we need to be working at our deals, and they all work them out at different paces, right? And of course, John doesn't necessarily want to have a deal, but still he has all this product and all these commodities out there that are not disaggregated from the others. So they kill Apple, and of course, then they go into the process of what we now know is rebuilding it.
Yeah.
Very ironic that Yoko would deal with the Beatles stuff, considering, she broke up the Beatles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And if anything, she's been helping to keep them alive. And she certainly took a burden off of his plate that he simply, a burden off of his shoulders. I was making metaphors. I could feel Rob's criticism. He took the burden off of John's shoulders that he certainly would have wilted under. He hated that stuff by that point. I mean, it would upset him.
Yeah. And
it probably allowed him to feel better. Yeah, and it allowed him to feel better about the other guys.
Yeah.
And not having to think about that in the same way. So they built this company, Lennon. They ran it out of, the first floor office, and it now had a place and a function, and she deserves a lot of credit for that.
You bet.
But he wasn't, in the book, he even said, I didn't sit home and bake bread every day. I baked it a couple of times. I mean, everybody always thought for 5 years he sat there and just baked bread. He really didn't do that.
Lazy writers.
Yeah. Well, and he also said, when somebody finally asked him some more in-depth questions, he goes, yeah, I baked it. But, it kind of pissed me off. You'd make the bread and you'd feel good about yourself, and people are eating it. Because you know why? They like fresh bread.
Yeah.
They do. It smells good. It goes great with tea and coffee.
You bet.
Everything.
My wife makes fresh bread. Absolutely. But that's the humorous part of it. It's like, John would put the effort into making a record, and it's there forever. You put it on a turntable, you can listen to it all the time. You make a loaf of bread, it's gone. That's it, Yeah,
and people are saying, where's the next loaf of bread?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Right away. Yeah.
Exactly. Ken, how important you just talking about Yoko and supporting John's work. One thing I thought Yoko did, which is still incredible if you think about it, was the Lost Lennon tapes. I mean,
what a gift!
I mean, how much did you get out of not listening to it as a fan, because that's when it first came on, but as a writer, because obviously you had to go back and listen to some of the stuff.
I went back and listened to all of the stuff. And when you take that storehouse,
There's a lot to listen to.
it absolutely is. You're talking about thousands of hours when you really accumulate it, because there were so many different takes of things, right? You add that to the outtakes from the sessions, and you're talking about just a sheaf of material.
Yeah.
It was absolutely invaluable, and one of the great gifts she gave to us in our extended mourning, which frankly hasn't stopped, if we're going to be honest about it, it's not a wound that gets better with age. It becomes more acute. One of the great gifts she gave to us was letting that go out into the world, knowing full well, what would happen with it, and that we all have it in some form or another. But, thank goodness for it, right? It allows us to understand the almost the archaeological history of how those songs get made, and just plus to hear the joy of hearing him having a great time.
Yeah.
As a professor of music, I'm sure you look at it a little differently than many people, not just liking it or enjoying it.
Sure, in class. So when we've talked about a song like Watching the Wheels in class, we start at the beginning, right? In one of its earliest manifestations, it was I'm Crazy. So we listen to those, and then you listen to the version where John tries it sort of like Revolution, picking out an old guitar tune. And that's one of my favorites, because at the end he starts making fun of the captain and Tennille. Because like us, he was watching that terrible variety show that was on. No offense, Tony. She's still with us. Not you, Tony.
I know you love it.
Yeah, do that to me one more time.
There you go.
Just once is never enough.
It is never enough for a Tony like you. Anyway,
wait, they were friends.
Wonderful to go through the Mesozoic layers of how those songs are made, right? Because then we can extrapolate ideas about compositional practices, the ones that are very particular to John Lennon, but then the similarities to how other folks write, even classical artists.
Yeah.
Ken, the album, we talked about the album not selling as well as they wanted. It sold well, but it didn't sell as well as they thought. A lot of critics said that John was soft, and they picked Yoko's songs over John's. I have to personally disagree. I really think that songs like Woman are, we did a show on classics and standards, and that's one that is both a classic and a standard now. And it's a beautiful song then, and Starting Over was a great first single.
Watching the Wheels.
Yeah, Watching the Wheels, exactly. To me, I never got the criticism that it was, quote, soft. I really didn't.
Okay, but I agree with you, and I think John was ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. And he's talking about very grown-up adult sort of things that, right, rock and roll wasn't known for at that point. I think that's part of the difference. But then there's this very historically important moment where critics, particularly the UK critics, are engaging in identity politics. They're championing different styles. They're, trying to push rock under a rock, if you will. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of angst and nastiness, quite frankly, in a lot of that criticism, and it doesn't necessarily hold up well today. But Abbey Road was, you've read those reviews.
Oh, yeah.
There are people in the moment not understanding Abbey Road. There are others who immediately get the beauty and power of the medley, right? But there are some that are just, lacerating that thing. Sgt. Pepper had a few of those too. So
Revolver had Ray Davies did Revolver.
That's right. Yeah, he was on assignment. Remember? But in the case of Double Fantasy, there's a very particular kind of critical attitude that just lacerates John in particular. As though it's cool to pick on, the guy who, oh my God, is 40. Because of course we thought 40 was 80 or 50 at least, or 60 at that time. Yeah. There's so much of that as part of that story, people flexing their writerly muscles, because 1980 was the end, not the end, but it was the culmination of a long period of inventing rock journalism. Right. By 1980, we all got Rolling Stone in that year. We could name a lot of the critics by name.
Oh yeah.
And we were younger than we are now. Right. So, but I could name I was 14 and I could name 20 or 25 rock critics easily at that point. So there'd been this creation of the rock and roll music press, rock and roll journalism. And those guys were engaged in a lot of differentiation and creating their brands. And some of those brands were built on the backs of being really nasty.
And also, Reagan had just been elected in November of 80.
Right.
And, a lot of people weren't happy about that. And I'm sure that's part of the whole background. In Great Britain, they hated Thatcher.
Oh, and they felt the same
rock
about
was
it.
much more active in the whole crowd of Great Britain for younger people than in America. America became new wave.
If you remember, Rob, I mean, I've talked a number of times in the show where, I think in a way, I always liked John's contributions to Double Fantasy, but I had to grow into John's stuff. When I was 15, I was listening more to what Yoko was doing. My musical, I'd grown up hardcore on the Beatles, but I was really into XTC and
is there a way to mute Tony? Because you didn't give me any instructions on the side of the screen.
Believe me, there's no way to mute Tony.
Yeah, that is not my experience at all. I remember hearing every one of his songs and thinking, I'm loving these.
Me too.
I like watching the Wheels. I really appreciate because I knew it was the backstory, so I was loving that. But I remember thinking to myself, he's back. I was so delighted that he was back. And I was so looking forward to the story going on. But I was looking at John's music almost as like, oh, this is the story. This is John. This is where he's at now. But in terms of just musically being stimulated, I was more like my ears were going over the Yoko material because that's just musically at 15 at the time, 14 at the time. I think that 15. I think that's just where my head was in terms of what else I was listening to. So I think
Yes, I'm Your Angel was what you were listening to?
No, not Yes, I'm Your Angel, but the stuff like Kiss Kiss Kiss. And it's interesting, but I just remember thinking that when I got starting over in Kiss Kiss Kiss, I remember thinking I'm going to probably play the B side of this a little more often. I'll love starting over in context with the album, but I was more, again, delighted, but I was in the Yoko stuff.
I remember when playing the single too and loving that B-side at 14 because it sounded kind of dirty. And I remember
it was dirty.
I remember like upstairs in my room thinking, is the door shut? This is another one of the things I'm going to get in trouble for,
Well, it really was dirty. And that was also part of the non-appeal for me. And I don't mean it because I'm a prude or anything, but when there was appeal for me in that.
We had not been disco. We had not been disco people, guys. So we hadn't had the 20.
Well, you didn't have I Feel Love, right? By
we
Donna
didn't have
Summer.
I Feel Love and Love to Love You, Baby. So we, this was new for us.
I did hear it. I just didn't. But the thing is, if you didn't like Yoko prior, and I don't mean personally, if you didn't like her music, her art, then with this, yes, the music itself was good, but her singing, let's face it, is not the best. So,
but it was the best out of everything she'd probably done to that point.
I don't know.
It was very, very thought out. I don't want to say pop because it wasn't pop, but it was thought out rock and loudness. I thought, she cared about trying to hit the notes.
I think it was some of the most melodic singing of her career. I loved Approximately Infinite Universe, but I think, Ken, you even mentioned that in the book that this one of the musicians or somebody comments that she's at her most melodic vocally on that record.
Well, and actually here, let's go back to the Lost Lennon tapes and all those outtakes. When you have occasion to hear those songs being built, she went through several variations until she got the vocals she liked. And Walking on Thin Ice, the original versions that they were cutting in August and September, her voice is not nearly what we hear, on that wonderful single. Yeah. So kudos to her. She had great vocal control.
Yeah.
I love Approximately Infinite Universe, but 14-year-old me didn't know about that.
Exactly.
Right. Obviously 14-year-old me was more mature as a listener than 15-year-old you, Tony. I'm really picking up on that. But that's probably for another
That's another show.
Yeah,
Oh, that's a whole other show.
I was enjoying Mrs. Costello and Jackson at the time, so that was where I was. That's where I was going. I was much in my Costello phase.
Who's the smarter listener will say. That's a whole other show. That's a whole other
I
show.
don't want to get there.
Well, Ken, I want to thank you for joining us on our show. Your book is called John Lennon, 1980, The Last Days in the Life, published by Omnibus Press. And you can buy it any place you find books or wherever you go. You also have a podcast, if I'm not mistaken.
That's true. Yeah, it's a new venture with our friends at salon.com. We've been working on developing it for quite some time, and it's called Everything Fab 4, where I talk to folks.
It's about the Beatles.
It's about the Beatles, but I typically talk to folks. For example, I've got an episode coming up with John Anderson of Yes about his Beatles origin story.
Cool.
And then of course, then we can branch out into their other stories about, say Yes, or what have you. In fact, the one I have to edit this weekend is John Oates.
Nice.
It was really fascinating because he did not like the Beatles at first.
Ooh.
He was down in Philly, and they had like kind of an attitude about it.
I always like Daryl Holt better anyway. I'm just kidding. And then I sowed my oats.
Well, that was good.
Anyway, on that funny note, we will end the show.
Note.
Thank you, Ken, for joining us. You have a website also?
KennethWomack.com.
All right. Thank you. Again, I'm Rob Leonard. I've been your moderator today on the Fab Four Free For All. Joining me, of course, is Tony Triguardo.
Night, folks. Night.
And Mitch Axelrod.
Take care, folks.
Take care and bye-bye.
Thanks, Ken.
Fab 4 Free For All was edited and produced by Tony Triguardo at Word of Mouth Studios in Westbury, New York.
The opening and closing theme is My Dolly by the band The Badge, featuring longtime listener Jeff Slate, available on its debut album Digital Retro and recent Best Of compilation, as well as from the Fab 4 Free For All website.
Thanks for listening to Fab 4 Free For All.